So with all that said, I'm going to actually remove a limitation. I know that whole spiel, and then I go and I take away limits. Well, not all the limits. We're still going to be using chord tones and using our set harmonic progressions, but now we can connect those chord tones. And we will connect the chord tones with non-chord tones. So what is a non-chord tone? Well, it's pretty simple. It's a tone that does not fall within the harmony of the chord. If you have a C chord, which is C, E, G, then an A would be a non-chord tone. Now I realize you can always say that the C chord with it's a C chord with an added 6, but we're not talking about jazz harmony here. We're still just using simple triads, and for now it's a non-chord tone. In fact, every other note of the scale except for C, E, and G would be considered a non-chord tone. So that means D, F, or B. We aren't going to use any of the chromatic notes yet, so don't worry about these. None of that stuff's going to be going on. Now, in traditional theory, there are several different kinds of non-chord tones, also known as non-harmonic tones. But the two that we are going to be using are the neighbor tone and the passing tone. So if you look at any two chord tones, you either have two different notes or the same note. For instance, in this example, you have the chords C, G, C. And across all of them, you have the notes G, G, G in the melody. In a situation like this, you can connect the notes using non-chord tones. Specifically, we would use something called neighbor tones. Now, a neighbor tone moves stepwise up or down and then resolves back to the original note. And moving up makes it an upper neighbor tone. Moving down makes it a lower neighbor tone. Also, let me cover the definition of resolve just in case you don't know it. Resolving means to move from dissonance or tension to rest. So I'm going to resolve this B up to C, or I'm going to resolve this F down to E. That gives it a little bit more, or releases the tension from it. So in this case, after the first G, we would move up to an A, and then we could go back down to the G. Because it's a neighbor tone, it resolves back down to the chord tone. And then from here, we've got a neighbor tone that moves down to the F, and then back up to the G. And then this F is the lower neighbor tone. So it sounds like this. Now the same goes for any other times that we have, the same chord tones. Here we have a 1 going to a 4 going to a 1, and you've got C's on top, so you could do this. In this next one, we actually have C going to a 3 chord, going back to a 1 chord. So. Now, obviously, if we are limiting ourselves to just one chord tone per chord, we don't have that many options. So we can also use multiple notes per chord. Let's say that we have a C chord in the first bar and then a G chord in the second bar. We could write something like this, where we've got these are all chord tones, so now we can add neighbor tones in between each of them. Something like this. Now let's look at connecting two different notes. Let's just say, for instance, we are connecting the following chord tones, C and E. Well, we can't use a neighbor tone because it wouldn't resolve back to the original note. In fact, we need to use a passing tone to get from one chord to the next. Now, a passing tone is a non-chord tone that moves stepwise from one chord tone to the next closest chord tone. It's a relatively simple concept from one chord tone moving through a passing tone to the next chord tone. Let's go ahead and demonstrate it. For instance, if we were to go between C and E, we know that we have one non-chord tone, the D. So we can put the D between the two notes. In this case, D is a passing tone. It passed from C, a chord tone, through D, a non-chord tone, to E, another chord tone. If we were going to connect E and G, well, we have F as a passing tone. Now that's a simple example. Between G and C, you actually have two non-chord tones, A and B, and this is called a double passing tone. Let's say, for instance, though, we want to connect C to G. Well, we would have to start by varying the rhythm just a little bit in order to add the additional passing tones. So we could do something like this. Or we could even change it up even more and do something like this. In this case, we still have the same passing tones, which are D and F, but the E, which is still considered a chord tone, is in the middle, even though it's a much shorter duration than that C. So for now, we are staying diatonic, meaning that we won't be adding any accidentals like sharps or flats to our notes. This means that you will only have to either use a single passing note or a double passing note. In the case of G to C, for instance, you would have both the A and B. And pretty much all the rest, you only have the single passing note. Now, one last thing. For now, we are going to stick to unaccented non-chord tones. What does this mean? Well, basically, if you're changing the harmony, the first beat of that harmony, you want to use a chord tone. For the most part, that should keep you within the confines of unaccented non-chord tones. So here's an example where we've got an unaccented passing tone. On both of the chord changes, we hit chord tones. If that was an accented passing tone, it would sound like this. Now that is the basics of connecting the chord tones. Remember though, we are restricted to neighbor tones and passing tones right now, so the goal is to create as smooth a melody as possible with just those options. You will have to get inventive with your rhythms once again in order to make some of them work. So let's talk about the exercises. The guidelines for using the neighbor tones will be when you have two of the same chord tones in a row, then you can add a neighbor tone. You can use the upper neighbor tones or lower neighbor tones by going up one step or down one step. And you can add rhythmic interest by making the neighbor tones different lengths from the chord tones. And then the guidelines for using the passing tones. When you have two different chord tones in a row, you can connect them with passing tones. You can use single passing tones and double passing tones. And you can also add rhythmic interest by making the chord tones and passing tones different lengths. And then finally, make sure you follow the chord progressions given. Now in this case, we have some new chord progressions for you to use, and they sound like this. Here's the first one. And here's the second one. So have fun with the exercises.